And this morning we welcome back Ambassador McGurk for an update on the critical effort to counter ISIS. And the ambassador was one of the few in the administration sounding the ISIS alarm early on. As you did with this committee, we were holding hearings last February speaking about this problem and the need to use air power to turn back ISIS. After 4 months of the U.S.-led air campaign in Iraq and in Syria, ISIS still controls essentially the same amount of territory that it did in the summer. And one of the reasons for this, in my opinion, is the limited nature of this effort. We have conducted only about 1,000 airstrikes to date. Now, if you compared that to when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and the response on the part of the United States, back then we had 1,000 sorties per day. So you get an idea in terms of the response and how minimal it is compared to what we've seen in the past to deter an entity like this. Moreover, the committee is concerned by reports that targeting has been micromanaged from the White House. And this clearly has been an issue within the Pentagon. But even with this flawed air campaign, Kurdish and Iraqi security forces have pushed ISIS out of specific key infrastructure areas, such as Mosul and the Haditha dams. They've done that without the heavy equipment that they need. They've done that at great loss, the shedding of a lot of their blood. And frankly, more coalition air attacks would mean more ISIS defeats. Another pillar of the administration effort is to provide training and weapons to U.S. partners on the ground in Iraq and in Syria. But when we look at that program in Syria, U.S.-backed groups have seen no increase in support in the past several months. In fact, these Syrian groups have suffered from dire ammunition shortages in the last several weeks. We had meetings with a representative recently. They're out of ammunition. In addition to not being supplied with the heavy weapons they need to fight ISIS, and at the same time as they're fighting ISIS, for example, on the border there, Aleppo has ISIS on one side and 30, 40 airstrikes a day, barrel bombs being dropped from the Assad regime on their forces while they're trying to fight ISIS. In Iraq, the Kurdish Peshmerga remain the most effective fighting force against ISIS, but the administration and Baghdad have refused thus far to supply them with anything more than light weapons as they go up against ISIS's tanks and artillery and Humvees and other heavy weapons. Tragic event a couple of weeks ago when you had a small squadron of Peshmerga try to take on 10 tanks or 10 armored personnel carriers, 10 pieces of armor that were put into play by ISIS against them. They only had small arms, and as a consequence, they called in for airstrikes, but after 2.5 hours, and it took quite a considerable time for those airstrikes to come in, they had been wiped out on the ground. This is why we have heard from the foreign minister that the situation for the Peshmerga, with their need for armor and for artillery, for long-range mortars, for anti-tank missiles, that unmet need has had very real consequences for them. I am hopeful that the recent accord announced between Baghdad and Erbil, which I appreciate the administration has helped engineer, will speed support for the Kurds. If not, the ranking member and I have legislation to do just that. Although the administration notes that 60-plus countries have joined the anti-ISIS campaign, some key partners continue to perceive the administration's strategy as misguided. Turkey, for one, has withheld use of its air base, involvement of its ground forces and other resources. And the Saudis and other Arabs don't see how allowing Assad to pummel those on the ground from the air in Aleppo makes any sense. Instead, they push, of course, for a no-flies area along the Kurdish border, where they suggest they and Jordan can patrol that long-term to keep from having the Free Syrian Forces hit from the air by Assad at the very time they are trying to fight against ISIS. Meanwhile, there are grave security consequences to allowing ISIS to control a territory of this size of western Iraq and eastern Syria. Clearly, as of September, there were already over 15,000 foreign fighters within ISIS. And reportedly, ISIS has been recruiting 1,000 new fighters per month. This is part of the problem of not turning back ISIS, is that on social media, they use the argument that they're on the advance, they're carrying out their jihad, and of course this resonates with certain young men who enlist in their cause. This is why we would argue that a more effective strategy that would roll them back would hurt their recruiting effort. And these fighters, particularly with Western passports, have the potential to attack us at home. As members may remember, when Secretary Kerry testified here in September, he said, "It's time for the defensive strategy we and our international partners have pursued thus far to transition to an offensive strategy." Ambassador McGurk, with a lackluster air campaign, severely undersupplied partners on the ground, and key allies with deep concerns about the President's strategy, I just don't see how, this is a credible offense. And we'd like to talk to you, I'd like to ask you about that. And of course, next Congress, this committee expects to consider a new authorization for use of military force to support this effort. And that is something we will do under a time frame that is befitting of the gravity of the issue. And the committee also expects that the Commander-in-Chief will come to Congress with his request and work in a bipartisan way to garner maximum support. Before turning to the ranking member, I'd like to note that this is the last full committee hearing of the 113th Congress, and we have accomplished a lot in the last 2 years, for which I would like to recognize all the members for their contribution. And for those members who will not be returning, we wish you well